people pouring in, but because this is a chock full series, I'd like to get us started. Good day to people both locally in Nantucket, also in the Commonwealth, importantly around the nation, and those who are participating from our partner organizations internationally. My name is Lisa Craig. I'm with the Craig Group, and we welcome you all to this special Resilient Nantucket Earth Day event. Just as millions are gathering today to discuss our world and its climate, its environment, equity, and citizen science, so too are we gathering to discuss the role of cultural heritage in protecting and adapting to a changing climate and world. Parallel to Resilient Nantucket and the presentations and discussions we're hosting among local, national, and international experts on global sea level rise and its impacts on built and natural heritage, President Biden is hosting 40 world leaders in a summit, highlighting examples of how enhanced climate ambition can create jobs, advance technologies, and help the most vulnerable adapt to climate impacts. So this is the context within which we begin our 3 days of climate action. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a few minutes to recognize our team and sponsors. Over the next few days, you'll see the faces and hear some voices of leading and emerging preservationists, conservationists, and climate experts from around the world. But behind the scenes are a few colleagues that have worked to ensure you have a seamless online experience. Many thanks to my team, Kim and Karen, and Roxy Jewel Richardson of the Craig Group, Sean Reardon with the Geek Factory, Frank Schaap with NCTV 18, and Sarah Davenport and Doug Parsons with Simpatico, our online broadcast partners. Many thanks as well to our host, the town of Nantucket, and our primary funding partner, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Also, our sponsoring partners include Nantucket Preservation Trust, Acclimate, the University of Florida's Preservation Institute, Nantucket, the Nantucket Historical Association, Preservation Massachusetts, Remain Nantucket, and the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. We're all very fortunate to have you as partners in Resilient Nantucket. And with that, I would like to go ahead and welcome you to today's event and two of our speakers. I will do their bios together and then turn it over to our town manager. Libby Gibson has been Nantucket's town manager since 1995. In recognition of sea level rise and climate change issues and their impacts on the island, Ms. Gibson in 2019 led the establishment of the position of Coastal Resiliency Coordinator, who now works closely with the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee and the Preservation Planner on issues of historic preservation and coastal resilience. Massachusetts Senator Julian Cyr represents Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. First elected to the state Senate in 2016, Senator Cyr is now serving his third term and is a Senate Assistant Majority Whip. Prior to his election, he was Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for Environmental Health at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, interned at the Obama White House, contributing to green jobs policy and energy efficiency at the Council on Environmental Quality, and worked for the William J. Clinton Foundation's Clinton Global Initiative. Much more information about these two leaders is on our website, but at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Libby, and it is yours.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciate being here today. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 3-day virtual Earth Day event. As Lisa noted, I'm Libby Gibson, Nantucket's town manager. This Resilient Nantucket Forum, which starts today and runs through Saturday, will share the latest in information for climate science, resilient design, and cultural resource adaptation. As we know, Nantucket is an island located 30 miles south of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, for those of you who may not know the details. For those not familiar with Nantucket, the town of Nantucket and Nantucket County are coterminous. Nantucket was first part of Dukes County, which covers Martha's Vineyard, until it was officially transferred to its own Nantucket County in 1713. Nantucket was designated a National Historic Landmark District in 1966, which later expanded to all 3 islands of the Nantucket family, the main island of Nantucket, plus the islands of Tuckernuck and Muskeget. Nantucket is a historic island community with an increasing vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. This forum is intended to bring us pertinent information at the right time, and we begin to better understand how our future is going to be different as we adapt to and plan for change. The theme of this conference started with a focus on historic preservation as a component of community resilience, and it has been expanded to include the broader areas of climate action, cultural resources and natural heritage, climate impacts on coastal communities, community resilience, coastal resilience and hazard mitigation planning, historic preservation and adaptation guidelines, and coastal resilience policy to mitigate climate impacts. A lot of these words and topics sound very similar, and although they may intertwine and overlap, they are specifically different. Our presenters include local Nantucket leaders, along with global experts from a range of distinguished organizations, including the Urban Land Institute, the Union of Concerned Scientists, Delft University of Technologies, Architecture and the Built Environment, National Trust for Historic Preservation, Urban Land Institute Boston, National Trust UK, and the International National Trusts Organization. We are very pleased to announce that we have our state senator, the Honorable Julian Cyr, and our state representative, the Honorable Dylan Fernandes, attending the forum's closing session and panel discussion on crafting climate change policy and coastal resilience policy on Saturday at 12:30. And of course, we have Senator Cyr here now. You are not going to want to miss that session or any of the Resilient Nantucket Forum. Nantucketans' characteristics are ideal for just this sort of program, and we hope some of what is brought forward and or discussed can be used for modeling and planning in other municipalities or countries experiencing similar climate change issues, and or we can learn from the experiences of others. We understand that attending a 3-day program may be difficult for many people, and I'm pleased to announce that the Resilient Nantucket Forum is being audio and video recorded by our local Nantucket Community Television. The entire program will be edited and available online in a few weeks. This information will be shared with registered attendees when available and posted on the town's website. The agenda for the forum, including any last-minute updates, is available at www.resilientack.org. There are other ways to get the information that were provided via email, and this easy to remember mnemonic was set up in case you need it. Again, it's resilientack.org. The Resilient Nantucket Forum is made possible with a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, MVP, Program Action Grant from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. This action grant, which ends in this June, provided support to develop a Nantucket-specific set of suggested practices for adapting and protecting historic buildings which are at risk of flooding and sea level rise. The Flooding Adaptation and Building Elevation Design Guidelines document in final draft form is available online for review and information. The final version of the document is expected to be complete in mid-May. Parallel with Resilient Nantucket is another ongoing effort, the development of a coastal resilience plan for the entire island of Nantucket. Information about that work to date will be presented in one of the forum sessions. Finally, and I note there is a risk of not naming specific people, this forum would not have occurred as it has been structured and scheduled without the unwavering efforts of Lisa Craig and her team, including Kimberly Rose and Phil Thomason, and town staff, including Holly Backus, Chuck Larson, and Vincent Murphy. There are many others who volunteer their time to the town, including the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, led by Mary Longacre. We are grateful for their vision, dedication, and hard work. Last but not least, we'd like to acknowledge the Preservation Institute Nantucket and its director, Marty Hilton, who coined Resilient Nantucket and launched the initiative with the Keeping History Above Water Nantucket Workshop in 2019, along with the Nantucket Preservation Trust. A special thank you to all of those people and anyone I inadvertently may have omitted. And thanks to all of you attendees. Here's to a great conference.
I appreciate your leadership, Libby. This has been a terrific experience, beginning with the work with Resilient Nantucket a few years ago and Marty's strong leadership. And now we're moving into that next generation with the Coastal Resilience Plan. So this is an exciting time for Nantucket. Senator Cyr, we would welcome your remarks this morning.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Libby, as well. Always good to be with Libby Gibson. We've been working on a whole host of challenging issues, from making sure that Islanders have have the deciding say around issues as it relates to the steamship authority, to vaccine distribution, to wastewater, to a whole myriad of challenges. And thank you to everyone, Lisa and your team, for making today happen. And also a special shout out to my friend Mary Bergman, who was the first person who invited me to this. So it's good to be with all of you, and it's always great to be able to think and talk about Nantucket and resilience and the challenges it faces. I hadn't been on the island for quite some time, right? Because we've been social distancing, but it's school vacation week. And so actually on Tuesday, I snuck over to the island, mostly for my own personal enjoyment, for a day trip with a friend. And it was a beautiful day on Tuesday. And just a reminder of how special this place is. But also, as you're cruising around and you're looking at Nantucket and just the proximity of its infrastructure and how islanders make their lives in the climate crisis, that means that a lot is at risk and a lot is at threat. And islanders know better than anyone else that islanders are gonna have to change their ways of life, just as Cape Codders are going to have to change our ways of life to adapt in this changing world. And I think, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, sort of where we go from here, right? We're coming out of, a terribly challenging year, and we're not out of the woods yet by any stretch as it relates to COVID-19, but as there's sort of a glimmer of sort of being in a post-pandemic world, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. It's actually something I saw. I think I originally saw it on Instagram or something. And the quote essentially says, look, do we want to return to normal, or do we want to build something different? And I really think that whether it's in talking about the climate crisis or whether it's in the context of COVID-19, I think it's really on us to build something different, to do, to live our lives in a different way, because what COVID-19 has revealed, just as the climate crisis has revealed, is that the ways in which we've built our lives have real, glaring inequities and gaps that we've got to get serious about it, and that we really have to address. And so I think it really is on us to build something different. That's very much true in the climate space. I'm very proud to have been pretty involved, along with Representative Dylan Fernandez, in helping to shepherd through pretty historic legislation that was just signed into law in Massachusetts last month. This is putting Massachusetts on a path of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, setting very sort of targeted 5-year emissions targets, looking at how do we rein in carbon emissions, yes, in transportation, yes, in energy generation, but particularly our built environment, which is really kind of the next big challenging space. An additional 2,400 megawatts in offshore wind, a whole host of initiatives looking at environmental justice and other issues, really trying to meet the moment of climate change, right? And so, it was on us to get that done, but it's now on us not simply to rest on our laurels, but to make sure that we truly are meeting the moment. As it relates to the climate crisis, this is existential for our way of life, for islanders and for Cape Codders. I think it's really on us as well to get really serious about housing. Nantucket in 2020 saw a 34% increase in housing value, or in housing prices, I should say. That is just simply unsustainable. And whether or not Nantucket and whether or not Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard will be places with sustainable year-round community is going to be based on whether or not we get serious about housing production. And I know Nantucket has done more on housing production than any other of the 20 communities that I represent across the region. But, we really have a huge crisis on our hands. And I think it's really on us to get serious about how for Nantucketers to continue to be serious about housing production, for Cape Codders and Martha's Vineyard to sort of look to Nantucket as a model, and to really step it up. And indeed, if you look at how COVID-19 manifests in our communities, it's disproportionately been the island's immigrant workforce, which is a workforce of color, largely, who has disproportionately borne the brunt of illness, of disease, of cases in COVID-19. Why? Because you got, families of 15, 20 people living in 2, 3, 4 bedroom homes. That's not right, right? And we've got to that's got to be fixed. That's an issue of sustainability. It's an issue of racial justice. We see how, if you look at the data, islanders of color, or rather white islanders, are twice as likely to have received a vaccine at this point than Black and Brown islanders. Another sort of glaring disparity that we're working hard to fix, but I think is sort of indicative of how these gaps and cracks that we knew about, that those of us who do this work knew about in our community, have really been revealed to be gaping fissures in this work. So it's on us as well to build something different in other areas around early education. How do we provide and expand childcare? On us around solving the wastewater crisis. Nantucket, again, has done a lot of work, but there's going to be some real opportunity here with federal stimulus funds that can make a big difference. And so much more. So as you begin this 3-day convening, what I'm really thinking about is, not just going back to normal. How do we build something different? How do we build something resilient? So that's what I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about. I really encourage you to do as well, and just thank you for giving some of your time to participate in this. I know these are not the most well, in one end, this is not the most ideal setting, right? I think we'd all rather, be together sort of on island. On the flip side, right, this is making this, pretty awesome forum, which has happened for a few years, much more accessible. And so that's a bit of a silver lining as you begin. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for being here and thinking, creatively and dynamically about how we steward this pretty special island and this pretty unique region in the next years in how we have resiliency. So thank you for having me and enjoy the rest of the meeting. Take care.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate your time this morning, and thank you very much for really summing up what resilience is all about. It's not just about climate adaptation, coastal risk, and creating better ways in which to move forward to build back better. It's also about jobs. It's about inequity in housing, and it's about creating an environment that is protected, appropriate to Earth Day. So with that, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. Brenda Eckwurzel is Director of Climate Science at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she helps ensure that climate and energy program analysis reflect robust and policy-relevant climate science. Cultural heritage climate risk has been a focus of her work since she started and co-authored the report, National Landmarks at Risk: How Rising Seas, Floods, and Wildfires Are Threatening the U.S.'s Most Cherished Historic Sites. Brenda was named an American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellow in 2016 for her distinguished contributions and making the science of climate change accessible to diverse audiences. Before I welcome Brenda to start her remarks, I just want to remind you all, we do have a question and answer function. I encourage you throughout her presentation to post your questions. We will ensure that they are all addressed, so please don't wait till the end. And with that, my colleague, Brenda Eckwurzel.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and the entire team. It looks like we have leadership with Town Manager Gibson and Senator Sear really indicating change, embracing change for adapting, making inequities, eliminating them, and looking for a more resilient Nantucket. So what I'm going to do is look at this broader overview, and I'm going to share my screen so you don't see my, let's see if you can see the, oh, sorry about this. What I'm going to do is really talk about the honor of presenting during Earth Day, really. And I did start with thinking about what about the cover of the Historic Preservation magazine. So the National Preservation Trust of Nantucket Preservation Trust cover magazine, really showing this dramatic change and around this structure. And it talks about the forum that happened in September, and sea level rise and the storms and many things that people are aware of is obviously the topic of this deep discussion. I wanted to zoom a little further out from this structure and give a broader overview of what is happening. Why has this happened to this structure? And what is the climate change that we've already experienced to date? And so to do that, what I need to do is just honor that today is Earth Day. And as Nantucket, long living or visiting people to Nantucket, you know that this is really an ocean planet. So it must have been landlubbers that were naming this planet of ours, because really 70% of the surface of the planet is ocean. And so this is the famous blue marble image that NASA's created. And it reminds us that we really do live on an ocean planet. But why is that important to Nantucket? So Nantucket Island really benefits from the climate that's moderated by the ocean that surrounds it. But it's not always mild, and it's not static. And we know this too, as many people have already seen. Let's zoom further down from our remote sensing satellites and get right down to this tide station in Nantucket Island and look at what has it recorded historically. So at this tide station, it's about more than a 3 millimeter per year relative sea level increase that has happened since this tide station started recording the ebb and flow of tides and what is the change over time. There are many factors that affect relative sea level rise. I'm sure you're aware of them. And one of them is the change in global sea level from shrinking land ice and warming oceans, as well as relative sea level rise and many other changes that are going on the planet, and within Nantucket. So this is the past, and the past is an indicator of the future. But if you were to plan a resilient Nantucket based on this line, you could be off the mark. It would be almost a best case scenario, because we are flirting with the edge of an exponential curve. And happily, the tides and currents at NOAA, they have produced a series of graphs like this all around the coastal communities that are experiencing potential change. We see the historical black curve that we showed you as the mean for Nantucket, but these are the potential futures that depend on historic emissions that have baked in change for increasing sea level rise, but also potential more dramatic change as much as maybe 10 feet by the end of this century. So let's take the high end of that and see, is that a concern for Nantucket? So in the most extreme case of 3 meters or nearly 10 feet increase by the end of the century, the regions in light blue could be at risk from relative sea level rise. So, the blue regions deserve special attention for planning and making priorities among those regions based on community preferences. Now, the details are such that a lot of these beaches eroding are really destabilizing the cliffs, and then you have accelerated erosion of cliffs and movement back of the shoreline. I think what is perhaps a bigger concern for Nantucket are what I'm going to transition to next, and that is extreme events. And as this artist's rendition of a shipwreck off Nantucket by William Bradford reminds us, storms are not a new thing for Nantucket Island. However, there are things that are changing. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's quite dramatic. It's not that this hasn't happened in the past, but there is a changing nature about the different storms that might reach and impact Nantucket. So let's transition to that. So one indication of water level is, we'll go back to Nantucket Harbor and look at the historic tides and what is the tide height that would be, you know, a flood, a minor flood, a moderate flood, a major flood. Well, the record was approaching 7.9 feet water levels in Nantucket Harbor. Now, if we compare that to the top 10 historic crests, historical flooding for Nantucket Harbor, the 7 of the top 10 historic crests occurred since the year 2000. Now, that's a lot. And the year 2000 is a long time after that painting. So let's just take a look. What happened during the highest water level on record in Nantucket Harbor? It was around 7.9 feet higher. Well, this is what happened. This is at peak intensity on October 30th of 1991. And this is the so-called perfect storm that this included the tragic sinking of the fishing boat, the Andrea Grail. And it was the so-called, you know, basically author Sebastian Junger coined this term, perfect storm, in the book. And that he titled that, and it inspired the movie of the same name. And ever since, this has become part of popular culture as meaning the worst case. Well, unfortunately, climate change has shifted extremely rare events into rare events. And what was not even possible before is now possible. So let's look at the what could cause higher water than normal in a normal tidal cycle. Lots of times it's because a passing storm creates a local storm surge. And here's a plot of all the historical storm tracks ranging from a tropical depression through major hurricanes that pass within 50 miles of Nantucket, according to the historical hurricane track database maintained by NOAA. And so during the hurricane season, we can create storm surges that can create coastal flooding in Nantucket. And this is well known. Now, how is climate change interacting with a totally natural phenomenon, hurricanes, tropical cyclones? Well, okay. Nantucket Sleigh Ride was a whaling activity that inspired artists and songs. I guess really in the peak in the mid 1750s, 1780s, moving in the 1800s, whaling activities in the Atlantic were starting to decrease and moving to other places. But let's just take a year when basically NASA gets temperature record. We have a really good record of global surface temperature data to create a global map for the year September, which is often a hurricane. It's still within the hurricane season. And this is the monthly average departure from the historic baseline that NASA GISS uses, which is 1951 to 1980. And as we said, 70% of the surface area of Earth is ocean. So we're looking at ocean temperatures. And it's just a fact of hurricanes, tropical depressions, tropical cyclones. They need a minimum threshold of warm water at the surface of the ocean in order to thrive. So the season for tropical depressions and hurricanes depends a lot on that ocean temperature. And also, more importantly, one way to think about it, it is the way in the summertime that the Earth in the tropical regions can cool off. Hurricanes and tropical storms are a really effective way of moving the heat from the tropics to the polar regions. And in the Atlantic Ocean, that means these storms swing by Nantucket. Now, how strong they are, how powerful they are, depends on many factors, but one key ingredient is the surface temperature of the ocean. So let's look at last September. What was the monthly average? And the difference between this is, 1880. And this is part of climate change. This is inescapable, very hard to roll this back. So we'll show the next figure. It's the same baseline compared to, these are the monthly September departure temperatures from the average baseline of 1951 to 1980. Now, what you can see is that the oceans have warmed, and this means that conditions for these rare events and how strong they are when they pass by Nantucket is changing. And that's a really bottom line fact that is inescapable. Okay, it's not only the summer that Nantucket has to be worried. So storms don't just occur during the hurricane season. The nor'easter season can be devastating. So this is Coast Guard Station Brant Point after Winter Storm Juno caused damage with hurricane force winds, flooding, snow, and ice. And this photo was taken by the US Coast Guard. So nor'easters are really quite a phenomenon, and year-round residents to Nantucket know this well. This particular storm, which was named Winter Storm Juno by the Weather Channel, really made headlines because, as the New York Times put it, it was one of the hardest hit areas by Winter Storm Juno was Nantucket. And the impacts were loss of phone service, loss of power, very big disruptions to the infrastructure of Nantucket for those who lived through Winter Storm Juno. So the idea is that nor'easters are quite devastating to everyday life, and they also are something that are changing because of climate change. There are not as many studies out there, but the Fourth National Climate Assessment cited this long-term look at nor'easters and the variation of storm frequency and intensity during the cold season of November to March between the mid-latitudes and high latitudes. So what you see in the right graphs is that the difference from the long-term average in the more recent decades, it is more intense winter storms over recent decades. And that is a detected change that is happening. And scientists are trying to figure out all the answers. They are not all in, but some early clues are coming in over the last decade. And I'll go through one factor that's changing. Many factors are changing, but I'll go through one that you may have heard of. And I'm going to give you this long URL, but at least it has English words and not too many numbers and weird characters. So I'm going to leave it on the screen. But I encourage you to go 4 minutes into this video to see the science visualization that was brought to you by CBS News, because it's one of the best I've seen to explain some of the factors that are happening in the Arctic and how it can change winter weather in the region of Nantucket and really New England and the eastern seaboard of the United States. So meteorologist Jeff Berardelli is going to talk about some things in this video. I won't share the video because that probably won't work. So I took some screenshots, but before we do that, the screenshots are going to have some terms. So let's describe what's going on here. So the Arctic polar vortex is a strong band of winds in the stratosphere surrounding the North Pole, and it's about 10 to 30 miles above the surface. So this polar vortex is far above and typically does not interact with the polar jet stream. And the polar jet stream is simply the flow of winds in the troposphere, which is about 5 to 9 miles above the surface. However, when the polar vortex is especially strong and stable, the jet stream stays farther north and has fewer kinks. It's almost, this is schematic, but it looks like a steady, almost straight circle around the Arctic. And this keeps the cold air contained over the Arctic, and the mid-latitudes are usually warmer than usual when you have a stable polar vortex. However, in a couple recent decades, every other year or so, we see that the Arctic polar vortex dramatically weakens. And the vortex can be pushed off the pole or split into 2 and sometimes 3. Right now, it's being split into 3 this week. Sometimes the polar jet stream mirrors this stratospheric upheaval, becoming weaker or wavy. And at the surface, the cold air is pushed southward to the mid-latitudes and warm air is drawn up into the Arctic. And these can set up certain patterns in the Northern Hemisphere over a winter season, and you can get really extreme weather. And this is just one change, and it's interacting with other processes that are happening in other ocean cycles like El Nino, La Nina, and so on. So let's go to some screenshots of the video, and I encourage you to, the URL will be at the bottom of each of these screenshots. So, and here is, in case you want to have what I just said, it's all in this wonderful infographic from NOAA. So Jeff Berardelli is going to be explaining what happened. He's doing this broadcast on February 1st of this past winter, and he's going to describe events that happened 2 weeks prior and 1 week prior to him standing in Central Park with the snow falling as he's giving this broadcast. So 2 weeks prior to this broadcast, over a couple of days, there was this sudden stratospheric warming over the Arctic. And you can see from the temperature change, you're looking at 100 degrees of change. And it's good to remember that the Arctic is warming about more than 3 times than the global average temperature. So there's a lot of change happening up in the Arctic, and it is making a difference for the Northern Hemisphere for sure. So this disrupted the polar vortex, as that NOAA schematic shows us, and the jet stream became wavy and moved south to bring the cold air to the United States. Now, a week before the broadcast, conditions in the Pacific Ocean brought a huge amount of water, what meteorologists refer to as an atmospheric river. It's so much water to California. Now, this atmospheric river of water moves east and encounters a blocking low pressure storm in the Atlantic, a lot in part to, and the interaction with the cold Arctic air because of that sudden stratospheric warming, disrupting the polar vortex. You have this cold Arctic air sitting there when this atmospheric comes across, and it brings moisture into this cold air, and it leads to blizzard conditions. And a number of these disruptive polar vortex events occurred this winter and is even influencing this week in the Northeast US. Okay, so that is the world we have. And you've seen how climate change has already impacted the ocean, the seas around Nantucket, the storms, the extreme events. Now, if you're planning and designing for adaptation, to protect community choices within the region of Nantucket and beyond, we have to take into account the combined risks that are happening with climate change. And these need to be factored into community choices for designing for adaptation for resilient Nantucket. So here's a helpful tool that you're probably aware of. It's by the US Geological Survey. And as you can see from this assessment, the Coastal Vulnerability Index to sea level rise, Nantucket really stands out in the region. This is an area where an incubator of good ideas, testing best practices that could benefit the region and beyond is really paramount and rather quite urgent. As you can see, that many areas of the level of are at the level of very high coastal vulnerability according to this scale. And this classification is based upon multiple factors: geomorphology, regional coastal slope, tide range, wave height, relative sea level rise, and shoreline erosion and accretion rates. So the past can be an indicator of the direction of change that likely would continue in the future. So the same tool can be looked at to look at the past. However, future rates of change are likely to be larger due to past emissions and possibly much greater depending on future global emissions of heat-trapping gases. So once again, let's look at Nantucket, and we see that the historical long-term shoreline change rates are in the 1 to 2 meters per year loss within many areas, and more than 2 meters per year loss over 78 plus years. So this is something that Nantucket has already been grappling with. So another thing to remember is that it's important to also stress test design choices for what would be a rare event, such as a class 3 nor'easter, which is in this, the highest level that this tool gives for planning. And this is showing the output for extreme water levels and mean water levels around Nantucket. And you can see the different areas that are at higher risk and those that are slightly less risk. And remember, this is for the nor'easter risk. And if they're also only looking at the open ocean portions of the coastline in this particular tool. And it's not just the nor'easters, as we said. Also, this tool shows the stress test design choices for hurricanes, and the highest point it goes for this region in this tool is for a Category 4 hurricane, mapping the mean water levels and the extreme water levels. And the point is, when you're designing a coastal community for resilience and taking into account all these different factors, you can look to the past to see what was the worst storm. You can look to the future with some of these tools, and you have to realize that the frequency of more severe storms impacting a region can be something that could be the stress test for seeing over the lifetime of a structure that you want there to be there, maybe 50, 100 years, 200 years, what could you possibly design for? So this is a key component from the National Climate Assessment I want to close with before we get to some key takeaways. So how do we put all this together in terms of coastal property? The fourth National Climate Assessment assessed that by the end of this century, the entire United States, the coastal property annual damages could be as high as $100 billion per year, just reacting to coastal property damage from the various factors of climate change. Now, one thing happens if you can reduce this cost by around 22% if you don't do this high emissions pathway, what we call RCP 8.5 in the National Climate Assessment, and do a lower emissions pathway of RCP 4.5, which is a little bit higher than what the Paris Agreement wants us to do. So you only get about a 22% reduction. And this is basically saying in dollars what climate science is telling us. Basically, the changes in the ocean are baked in, they're gonna get worse, and the rest of that pie, if we want to reduce the damages, is adaptation. That's why designing for adaptation is critical for coastal communities. Another way of putting it in the National Climate Assessment is this graph, looking from the year 2000 out to the end of the century for the whole US, making an assessment. Basically, trillions of dollars cumulative would be spent in sea level rise and storm surge damage. The big takeaway is that the costs are much higher without adaptation than if we did do adaptation. It is really important because of the baked in nature of the changing ocean conditions with climate change. So this is all, you can see this for the United States, and this is all in this chapter table. But one thing that's important to point out with coastal property damage is it's one of the ones, if you look at the high damages in the darker column and the lower damages in the right, which we just did in the pie chart, you see that coastal property damage is one of those, other than also coral reefs. You know, adaptation is probably the best option because of some of these changes. Whereas other things like extreme heat mortality, reducing emissions really make a big difference, as well as some other winter recreation. Reducing emissions can really make a big difference for the winter recreation industry. So the main thing is coastal property damage. There are other things that are of concern to Nantucket: roads, inland flooding, bridges, shellfish. So I encourage you looking at that. So let's close here with the key takeaways. are, as we said, we live on an ocean planet, and Nantucket Island community resilience depends on design that adapts to that changing ocean. And with regard to extreme events, what was once a very rare weather event is now rare. What was not even historically possible is now possible. And the key thing is that we have to take into account the combined risks from climate change. Designing for adaptation to one risk will likely not withstand the combined risk converging during an event or happening within the same year or decade, when different types of extremes or corrosive, more severe daily damages happen more frequently, more severe over the course of a year or a decade. That can really be a drag on the economy of a region unless we plan for it and adapt for it. That's why it's so important, this forum and the change that was embraced by Town Manager Gibson and Senator Sear. And we'll see in forums at on this Saturday and through Friday. This is going to be a great discussion, and I really thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate all the recent information, Brenda. We're all up to speed as we need to be annually. I think in particular, the issue of cost is something we need to be looking at as well, because to your point, mitigation is what we know needs to be done. Adaptation is past being needed to be done. I mean, we are urgently looking at adaptation and designing for that in all communities. Before we start getting some of the Q&A coming in, I encourage you all to ask questions. Do remember, this is an opportunity for you to learn more about what can be done in Nantucket, in your own community, and also what the Union of Concerned Scientists is doing. And I'm going to start a question with that, because you mentioned this, the issue, we're in Earth Day. We have impacts on natural resources. We have impacts on industries, fisheries, and the like. So obviously, this is something of great concern to Nantucket as they are moving forward with their coastal resilience planning effort. Can you tell me something in terms of any of the work that you've been involved with or that the Union of Concerned Scientists is doing on the topic of impacts to natural resources, industries tied to ocean habitats and the like?
Sure. I mean, one thing we've been paying attention to with some regional work in Maine, looking at the Maine Fishermen's Forum, looking and some of the work we've done in Massachusetts as an organization, looking at coastal adaptation and advocating for basically climate change plans and adaptation policies that help communities really design with climate change in mind. And so all of those incentives. Also, for example, you may be aware that the species are on the move. The places where lobster used to thrive, they're seeking colder waters, and they are on the move and where they're able to thrive, and the fisheries are moving with them. But it's going past and by different communities who have invested lots of infrastructure in those fisheries. And at the same time, there's other fish species that are coming in to play. So the fishery story and the changing temperature of the waters, some of the ocean acidification effects are something that really global emissions reductions can really help. So it's not just the coastal communities, infrastructure, offshore, what is the livelihood of activities of coastal communities from southern New England to northern New England, of which Nantucket has a key role and care and cherished activity is the fisheries and all the cultural heritage around that. So one way to do that is advocating at the federal level. There was just released for the current president a scientist sign-on letter. Over 1,500 people signed on to request that the current administration rejoin the Paris Agreement with a nationally determined contribution that's really advocating for a basically cutting carbon emissions and heat trapping emissions 50% by 2030 on the road to net zero carbon, heat trapping emissions by 2050. So it's a very aggressive target. And today we're seeing indications with the presidential forum at the State Department that's going on that announcement is it looks like in line with that, in line with the science, in line with what the global community has indicated is needed for global emissions.
Thanks for that. I'm going to open it up if folks have some questions they'd like to address to Brenda. Please put those in the Q&A, and I have Kim and my colleague Karen behind the scenes to capture some of those and let me know what they are. One reference you did make was stress testing design choices. And can you maybe speak just another minute or two about that?
Sure. It's kind of an engineering approach where lots of times you design a bridge and you have to design it, that it may not have a traffic jam with the highest weight vehicle on the bridge at the same time in both directions, completely stopped, but you want to design for that. But you don't just design for that weight, you design for a gale force wind also there, and a ship that wants to pass underneath, maybe creating wake along as well as the gale force winds along the pilings, and all the factors that could happen in an extreme event for that bridge, that it could withstand all those combined risks happening at the perfect storm for that bridge. And then you design within cost even one better than that. With climate change, it's very difficult because of some of these changes are so off the charts. How do you design for that? So some of the recommendations are look at the stress test, look at what your design costs are, and make sure that whatever design you have can be iterative, you can learn from it, and you're not stranding your assets or your costs, that you could build back better, but build in a new normal and not rebuild, but be building something that can be almost like a transformation. So lots of times, another stress test is say, what if individuals are making choices versus a community-wide choice? We can look at ancient historic choices where communities decide to make breakers offshore to protect an entire community, such as Cartagena. And those protected those communities for 300 years. What ends up being cost effective when you think about the worst case scenario at the end of the century is worth really thinking about what would protect most people and be the most equitable. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those costs may be cheaper than individual actions, but you have to look at that. It has to be community preference.
I got a kind of a follow-on in some respect about those weather events, those extreme events. What impacts do those events have on groundwater levels due to upwelling? And are there any studies looking at this? Obviously, significant concern to Nantucket.
Yes, groundwater is a precious resource, right? Luckily, you have the bluffs and from the glacial moraine. And one thing that does happen with these storms is it is known that hurricanes are carrying more intense precipitation where the rain falls. But that can be a good thing and also a bad thing, because a more intense storm can cause more erosion. But it does mean that you're going to have some recharge. If you can design infrastructure to capture when the rain happens and where you can hold it in ways that can help you get through. For example, there are places that have intentional recharge ponds to keep the ocean from coming in. I've worked on cases in California, Southern California, where you try to have the river water slow down so you're increasing the rate of recharge so you prevent that wedge of saltwater intrusion coming in from the Pacific Ocean. So if you think about working with the hydrology when the water comes and other times it may not be there, how do you redesign your hydrologic infrastructure to make sure that you smooth out your year and you pay attention to that saltwater wedge that is less quality water compared to the higher quality water.
Yeah, that's great information. I think along those lines, if it is something you guys are working on, we'll get back to you to get any reference you may have on the work you're doing and include that in our post-event mailing out to folks. I think they're very much interested in looking at studies and analyses that have been done on that topic. And then another question in regards to nature-based solutions. Are these really long-term solutions, and is there value in pursuing nature-based approaches more where possible, especially obviously for island communities?
Sure. I remember getting my first lesson in nature-based solutions versus hardened infrastructure when I was studying coastal processes up on Herring Cove Beach in Cape Cod. And I went there for 2 years, and I surveyed 8 kilometers or 10 kilometers of beach for every spring tide over 2 years on the winter beach and the summer beach. And really seeing the resilience of the sand was so dynamic. It's going offshore, it's coming back on, it's being stored in the dunes, or you have your bluffs from your glacial moraine source. And that keeping the sand dynamic and moving and allowing that to happen is critical. When you put up we used to have to, be asked to do the calculations of significant wave height. And when that hits a vertical structure, when we were surveying, we would feel the waves hitting us when we were trying to survey, get as much of that beach profile. And any little increase in height, the amount of how easy it was to knock us over compared to smaller waves. When you realize that if it's breaking on a more nature-based slope compared to a more vertical wall, the vertical wall is almost reflecting all that energy back, and it's an immense amount of energy, and it increases the erosion. So whatever you have will topple down if you're eroding underneath. So a lot of times vertical walls just get undermined and then they fall over. And so that's why you start seeing sloped hard debris and things like that. But the harder it is, the more you're reflecting that energy from the ocean right back out, and whatever's immediately offshore that's not hardened just gets eroded away. So normally what you want to do is distribute the water, let it flow, and make sure what's around is not someone who just can't afford protection and is getting the brunt of it. You might want to have more equitable solutions that are community-wide that allows water to flow when it comes and make sure it's flowing in a less harmful way, usually. And there's lots of nature-based ways that help, and also some mimicking nature, ways that you can do better design for that. And some of the things are temporary, because you don't want to, you want to visit a place and be near that dynamic coastal interface, but sometimes during a storm, you have to have temporary ways of redirecting water that's not always there, but can be deployed as fast as you need it.
And I think you actually, there was a question that kind of a follow on to that in some respects. You talked about breakers. Are there any studies about the effects of installing those kind of near offshore man-made breakers? For example, Nantucket's South Shore as a place that's being considered. So any analysis of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are historic precedents for that. As you know, Lisa, with historic preservation, looking at communities that have dealt with this in very savvy ways that are long-term studies, 300 years worth of data, if you want to talk about it. But also there are engineering studies that look at that as well. And more communities are starting to think about this, because you have to have a balance between deciding where you want to protect and also what would be impacted locally within the marine ecosystem, and how can you work with that. So some are trying to create quote unquote living reefs, or trying to species that would be taking up residence on such an offshore structure, try to create some sort of working with ecosystem biologists and other things. You can come up with more creative ideas that can, because it is really important to know that when the storms come, if you're breaking those waves, you are doing the function of what used to be nature-based systems in the region that are now gone, because those protections are now coming back and closer to what may be historic structures that you want to protect.
Well, thank you, Brenda. That is terrific. I think we're at our stopping here perfectly at 10:01. If you do have any other questions, we'll make sure that Brenda gets those, and her contact information will be provided again at the end of the day when we send out a recap. Just a joy as always to hear you and see your research, and thank you for making Nantucket front and center in your presentation today. I want to go ahead and remind everyone that we will be back in 15 minutes with Paige Pollard. And in the meantime, take a break, grab something to snack on, and join us back here in about 15. Thanks all. I want to welcome everyone back. We had a nice little break there, so I hope you were able to grab a bite. And again, just so everyone is aware, we will send out links to the documents and resources that are being discussed today. And with that, we do have our next presentation queued up. I think if we can introduce our next speaker, Paige Pollard. Glad to see you, Paige. Paige is here to take us actually down to earth, so to speak, on Earth Day. And she's going to be talking about an in-depth look at adaptation terminologies, technologies, techniques. And I very much look forward to this because it's what we do as preservationists on a regular basis. Paige Pollard is the co-owner of Building Resilient Solutions, BRS, which is a joint venture between her firm, Commonwealth Preservation Group, and Museum Resources Construction and Millwork. Paige is located in Virginia, and obviously another location, a historic location with very significant issues of sea level rise and climate impacts. She's responsible for client consultation, retrofit recommendations, and overall business operations and development for BRS. And this joint venture obviously was established in response to increasing retrofit consultation requests for historic buildings that were experiencing repetitive water inundation and nuisance flooding. I very much look forward to Paige's presentation and again encourage you to use the question and answer box liberally. Paige, glad to have you. We'll just need you to unmute. There you go.
Try and run this through my computer because I had my phone audio on. It's a little bit better, but I guess I'll run it through the computer real quick. I want to thank you all for including me in this esteemed lineup of speakers. I'm hoping I can bring maybe a local perspective and one from someone who's reacting to the challenges we all face, but in a very pragmatic way, on a building by building basis. To sort of set the agenda for what I wanted to address today, I wanted to give you all a little bit of an introduction to who I am and what our firm has done for the past 17 years and how we got into this retrofit and water inundation world. And then talk a little bit about those traditional strategies and some of the strengths, but also the limitations we've observed. And move you through the local policy and code issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis where I am in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and then provide a couple of case studies for some of the work that we've done. We feel that this is very localized work, and so I wanted to give you a glimpse of what we face in Hampton Roads in the hopes that maybe you would see some parallels in your communities. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about our future work. And obviously I am open to questions because often out of these types of presentations, the questions that people ask prompt us to further our thinking. So I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say. So as an introduction, Lisa mentioned, I own a historic preservation consulting firm called Commonwealth Preservation Group that was established in 2004 and focused on traditional historic preservation needs, National Register nominations, historic research, historic tax credit applications, preservation plans, and the like. Starting in about 2009, our clients began approaching us about what to do about inundation and nuisance flooding in their properties. And we really looked nationally to see who was working in that arena and found some good resources, but also found that in our region, we had challenges that weren't really addressed yet. So through trial and error, we helped people through some resiliency designs, and we ultimately concluded that we needed to get more formalized about that work. thus the creation of the joint venture of Building Resilient Solutions. BRS was created in 2018 and really was created resulting from a local foundation called RISE, which is intentionally developing the business community for climate change and adaptation in this region. Our region has an overall strategy to turn what is a challenge to our local economy into hopefully a contributor to our local economy by trying to recruit businesses focusing on climate change and adaptation. We were awarded significant for us grant in the first round of their funding, and that really launched the joint venture. We focus on individualized building and site analysis through monitoring and testing, and then retrofit solutions coming out of that monitoring and testing. We also provide post retrofit monitoring to determine whether the solutions are working. And eventually we will move into some lab environment where we're testing more customized solutions. To give you all a little bit of an orientation about where we are, you can see Nantucket on the screen in the upper right, and I'm located in Hampton Roads, which is a grouping of cities and counties in the lower southern eastern part of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
But we do a lot of work up and down the East Coast, focusing on Hampton Roads region.
Paige, I'm not seeing your screen.
I walk you through today are in Norfolk and Virginia Beach. Specifically, this map shows the city of Norfolk and the northern portion of the city of Virginia Beach. And you can see
Paige, are you able to hear us?
benefit from being adjacent to the Atlantic Ocean as well as the Chesapeake Bay. You all hear me?
We can hear you, Paige,
We
but
have a lot of inland waterways as well, which really create a large portion of our nuisance flooding. We are suffering from subsidence as well as storm-based flooding, as well as stormwater management issues and increased rainfall. As I'm sure you all are aware, there are a suite of solutions which FEMA recommends for dealing with flooding of historic properties and regular properties. And this graphic is intended to illustrate what those generally are. They recommend raising outdoor utilities and even utilities which are in basements or crawl spaces. They recommend incorporating flood vents, as well as filling in basements, which has proven to be a big challenge in our area. They also recommend home elevation for cases where there is significant damage or significant risk to a property. And then lastly, relocation or demolition. While we embrace all of these options in our work, we've also found that there is a large swath of properties for which these options really do not work. And we've had a lot of clients who have implemented the alternatives on this chart that are appropriate for their property and yet still have not solved their problem. In the city of Norfolk, the local government has been working very hard to engage in cutting edge policy development to help address our flood problems. And they embraced a major zoning ordinance update in 2018, which was award-winning. And it was designed and adopted as the most resilient zoning ordinance in the nation. It identified multiple opportunities to address flooding, both by employing risk reduction measures, additional protection measures, and also a more systemized process for evaluating retrofits. I think it's also important to point out that in Norfolk, our city is more than 92% built out. And so the majority of our properties that are at risk already have buildings on them. We're not talking about new development. Yet a lot of the most cutting edge thinking has focused on new construction and new development. So we have a gap there to fill in information and data. The zoning ordinance also implemented the FEMA allowance for exemption for historic properties and set in motion then the need to determine how those exemptions were going to be considered and approved. Almost simultaneously, the Uniform Statewide Building Code and the building code for the Commonwealth of Virginia set in motion updates as well. When they adopted the 2015 building code, there was a new requirement that indicated that substantial improvements would have to be built at the same standards as these located in the highest risk coastal areas. This requirement was embedded in the 2015 building code, but there was a grandfather period which expired on September 3rd. So on September 4th of 2019, everyone in the Commonwealth of Virginia was subject to this requirement. Now, interestingly, Norfolk chose to implement that portion of the building code early, and so they actually had more experience with the ramifications of that by the time it became mandatory. Some of those very well-intended policies did result in consequences that were adverse to historic properties and also weren't intended. First of all, the broad stroke requirements about the 50% trigger for substantial improvement leading to full compliance with FEMA requirements had an impact on properties that were not subject to flooding. So for example, we've had a property in our community where there was a small dryer fire. The smoke and water damage triggered full compliance with FEMA requirements. And ultimately, the net result was that dryer fire, which was confined to a laundry room, resulted in the full demolition of the house and reconstruction at design flood elevation for the city of Norfolk. Clearly an unintended consequence. Also, another result of this is that we're seeing that in our historic properties, when retrofits are implemented, we're losing a lot of the historic building materials, and those building materials are traditionally more resilient than a lot of the modern building materials that are being introduced. What that does is it enters that property into a permanent cycle of replacement where the historic building materials are gone, modern materials are installed, and then in the next flood cycle or the next flood event, those replacement materials necessitate replacement again, which is not a cycle that we find to be acceptable in our community. And then the last thing is that there seems to be the beginning of some property value reduction, which will lead to ultimately impacts to the real estate values in the community. And those reductions, I think, can largely be sorted out as our policies get more sophisticated and more targeted, and as there's more predictability in how all of this is implemented. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, the city of Norfolk adopted the FEMA option to allow historic properties to be exempted from compliance. And this was really a critical move. In the past, the city of Norfolk had allowed exceptions. And those exceptions were a little bit less clearly vetted and also left open the question of how the exceptions were made and the success of those exceptions. And so it made city staff uncomfortable because they wanted to ensure that they were being transparent and also predictable. And in FEMA analysis, there were questions about the process. The exemption provides a much more predictable path for property owners, and it also enables city staff to have a very clear and specific set of expectations. So an exemption can be allowed for a property that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Virginia Landmarks Register, or the local register. In order for the city staff to consider an exemption, we have to demonstrate that the traditional FEMA requirements would be adverse to the designation and contributing status of a resource. And most importantly, an exemption is not a free pass. We have to demonstrate that there are alternative strategies that will reduce the risk for FEMA, for the property owner, for the city, and for the building itself. We really believe that this tool is an incredibly important one for our community, for the preservation community writ large, but also for the city of Norfolk and its residents. But we have to act responsibly. For the design community, this opportunity means that we have to balance ethical standards with the risk on a site-specific basis, and also with the solutions that would be applied to that specific site. It also confers upon the design community and preservationists and property owners as well a significant responsibility to really analyze what is going on at that property, what are the true risks at that property, and then what are the most appropriate and effective solutions to reduce risk or manage risk. The opportunity is incredible. If you use this tool effectively, we found that you can reduce the cost on the front end, as well as the ongoing cost of property ownership in these flood vulnerable areas. And also, typically you get a more effective solution that reduces owner anxiety. It reduces the likelihood that you will be out of your property, and it also can make a more predictable way of dealing with a major flood situation. We, after having worked through many of these, we firmly believe that the exemption request option, while an incredible tool, it must be looked at as a site-specific tool. We do not recommend that localities adopt across-the-board policies for exemption requests, other than policies for how the application is made and how it is analyzed. I'm going to move into the case studies that we have put together for you today. 3 of them are in the city of Norfolk. Those are the 3 stars on this map that you see closest together. And one is a municipally owned historic house museum within the city of Virginia Beach. The first case study is a residence in Ghent. This property is located on a man-made waterway immediately adjacent to our downtown. It's a historic house that was built in 1901. The property is listed locally as well as on the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. As such, this property does qualify for an exemption from the trigger of FEMA compliance for major work on the property. We began working with this property owner as a result of outreach. She noticed that she had powdering of brick on both the interior walls of her basement as well as along the exterior perimeter. This brick powdering was going on over time, causing significant damage, and she had concerns. Next slide. So this property owner lives in a high-risk flood zone. Although you can see by these images, she has a full-height basement, and her home the foundation is made of brick and it's substantial, so that her first floor elevation is approximately 6 feet above grade. There are no known flood claims for this property. And that's an important takeaway that we've seen in a lot of our projects, that many properties are suffering from damage from nuisance flooding or from rising groundwaters. And these are not storm-based events. And so they're not registering on anyone's list as FEMA claim properties or as, vulnerable properties. In her case, based on the city zoning requirements, the base flood elevation is 8 feet, and the design flood elevation is 11 feet. When we first met this property owner, we went out and toured her property, and we noted the obvious brick degradation, which you can see in this image, as well as the limited pervious area on site. And we noted the concrete swale that was introduced by a neighbor that abutted the base of her building. You can also see in the lower image that there is moisture coming up through the basement floor, and we wanted to determine what the source of that was. Next slide. The next step in our process is to really talk honestly with the property owner about what their goals are. We've learned through our evaluation and documentation process that we need to make sure that we set reasonable expectations, and we can use our data to help the property owner understand those expectations. At the front end, we want to know what they're hoping for, so that we can make sure that we do our best to respond to those dreams and aspirations. In this case, the property owner acknowledges that she will likely be the last owner of this property. She wants to retain long-term ownership. She's willing to invest in its future. She does not have an economic need or a vision that she needs to pass it along or sell it to someone else. She also is quite in support of necessary remediation, including dealing with the groundwater penetration, stabilization, and addressing the deterioration of the masonry to ensure the building's longevity. Next slide. With that information, we took our monitoring equipment, which includes a customized set of probes that we install at various locations. Those locations are determined based on what we see on site through preliminary field work. Those probes then take readings at 30-minute intervals over the course of days and sometimes months. In this case, we installed our equipment for 81 days. What that does is it tells us with each probe what the moisture level is in the wall in that location. And we both install them vertically and horizontally. So that we can see what the variation of the moisture levels is. And then we can overlay that with other information like the tidal positions, the relative humidity, the ambient temperature, the lunar cycle, so that we can get a good picture of what's happening in the environment overlaid with what's happening at the property. Next slide. Our findings in the case of this property were that some were surprising and some were not. We definitely saw that there was a compounding factor by water accumulation coming from major rain events. We also clear correlation between the change in the water level of the Hague and also the groundwater level with movement of moisture up the masonry column and up the masonry basement walls. And we saw a clear line at the first floor level where the heated and cooled space began. So the moisture was really stopping at that first floor line. We did see that there was a clear correlation between some of the environmental factors and the moisture content in the masonry. And we also noted a variety of just sort of standard maintenance items, which might relieve some of the documented findings. Our recommendation was to focus the retrofits on what we call the low-hanging fruit, by addressing some of those maintenance items and also relieving the building of the concrete floor that was abutting the exterior wall. It was preventing evaporation of the water and forcing water up the masonry walls. We have some more invasive alternatives that we want to explore, but we need to get a little bit into our lab before we, which we'll talk about in a bit, before we're prepared to implement some of those recommendations on someone's home. So in the case of this property, we really feel like the property owner has a series of steps that they can perform. And between each campaign of work, we intend to go back and monitor to see what issues we've addressed and what issues remain to be addressed. So specifically, we are looking at regrading and removing the organic ground cover. And I think this is important for preservationists to remember that sometimes those good building stewardship practices need to be reiterated for property owners because they can address big picture problems, you know, and can go a long way towards forestalling the impact of moisture inundation. There is some HVAC drainage that needs to be addressed, making sure that the cellar entrance is watertight and repointing the masonry. Even if that repointing is essentially a sacrificial exercise, the mortar can work to wick the water away and help protect the bricks. If that work doesn't solve the problem sufficiently for this property owner, then we have secondary solutions such as installing a sacrificial layer of plaster on the exterior wall, which would really draw the water out of the masonry. And that plaster would be something that would need to be reinstated periodically. Our second case study is a historic property in the Chesterfield Heights neighborhood of the city of Norfolk. This neighborhood is very interesting. It's a National Register neighborhood, primarily owner occupied. It is the subject of a major HUD-funded infrastructure and resiliency project in the larger neighborhood. And that project is the result of some student work that led to a larger effort to look at resilient design. There are environmental and green infrastructure projects underway as part of the larger investment, as well as some engineered solutions. The property that we're working on in this neighborhood was built in 1921. It is contributing to the State National Register District and therefore is eligible for the exemption. The property owner has owned the property for more than 50 years. There is a mother living there who's in her 90s and her daughter who is a caretaker. They originally approached us because they noticed that they were getting more and more disruption, and they started experiencing flooding of their property in 2009. That flooding had not happened prior to 2009. Next slide. Give you a little bit of context about this building. It is in the 8-year high-risk flood zone. The base flood elevation is 9 feet and the design flood elevation is 12 feet, putting the entire first floor below design flood elevation. The property owner noted that an adjacent home that had been vulnerable to flooding was acquired and demolished in about 2008. And the developer who purchased that property created a little bit of a plinth and then built 2 elevated homes on that property. And the net result, we think, is that that likely made her home the first line of vulnerability to flooding, and that's why she started to see impacts in 2009. She's had 3 flood insurance claims since 2009. And when we went through and analyzed the building, we did note that we believe during the course of those repairs, which were FEMA funded, the contractor who did the work misunderstood the way that the structural system for this building functioned and implemented a more traditional rim joist and joist system that was spanning across just a skirt wall of infill between the historic brick piers. So our first order of business is addressing the structural deficiencies of this house to make sure that it's safe for the family that lives there. We also noted that there had been some modern replacement materials installed after the first flood event. And this is the first time we really saw in action that cycle of replacement. So the traditional pine structural system was removed and replaced. The subfloor, which had been heart pine, was replaced with an engineered product, and same with the flooring itself. And so now that material has been replaced a couple of times. Next slide. In interviewing the property owner, their stated goals are to age in place. As I mentioned, we have a 94-year-old mother and then a child caretaker who is in her 60s. And their vision is that they would like to live out their lives in this home. They do have some accessibility issues, which are completely unrelated to the flood issues, except that we know that home elevation for this property would not enable those property owners to comfortably live in their home. Also, this property has been put through the FEMA analysis to determine whether it's appropriate to use grant funding to subsidize home elevation, and the economics don't work for it either. So this property owner owns the house outright. The flood history will prevent, and the flood insurance costs will prevent her from selling the property and achieving any return that would enable her to buy elsewhere. And so our goal is to help kind of manage risk, set expectations and predictability for when there are flood events, reduce the number of times that they experience disruption from flood events, and then also lend some predictability to the cost and the time frame for repairing post-flood. Next slide. Likewise, in this property, we installed our monitoring equipment. We wanted to make sure we really understood where the water was coming from. As I mentioned earlier, this neighborhood is also the subject of a massive infrastructure project that's HUD funded, and that work is happening simultaneously. So throughout development of the design and retrofits for this property, we've been in close coordination with the city and the project design team for the larger neighborhood project to make sure that the work that we're doing on an individualized basis is going to be complementary and not in any way undermine or compete with the larger neighborhood work. So the site monitoring became very important at this property so that we have a baseline, since we've got moving parts in our work, and then we also have moving parts in the larger neighborhood. So we installed equipment here only for 41 days because it was, as you can see in the chart, the data coming out was very consistent. There were not a lot of deviations, and we could see some very clear correlations in a relatively short time frame. Next slide. Based on the data and based on our analysis of what was going on in the larger infrastructure project, and also using the client's wishes and needs, we came up with a series of recommendations. These recommendations were intended to address, to the best extent possible, the project goals within the budget that the property owner has. We applied for and received an exemption to the special flood hazard area requirements by the city of Norfolk. That enabled us to move past the idea of lifting this home, which was financially not an option, and and really from a physical standpoint, wouldn't have enabled the property owners to stay in the building. We were able to get approval to repair the previous work that was undermining the structure of the building. And we were able to incorporate our project design into the larger neighborhood-wide design. We are planning to use resilient materials both on the exterior and interior below the design flood elevation. And we are also implementing a design that will enable the property owner to very easily and quickly dry out the property in the event of the next flood. We're giving her a checklist for pre-flood and post-flood actions to take to minimize the disruption and the damage to her property. We are also, as an added challenge, implementing universal design so that the property owner can age in place. And again, it's important to underscore, in this case, we are not, the predicted lifespan of this property is about 30 years. We're not trying to make this property last for another 100 years because based on our data and based on our analysis, that's just not feasible. And I think it was very valuable to the property owner in this case to be able to look at that data and have a conversation about how we drew that conclusion, and for her to understand that it wasn't based on a best guess or a larger predictive model, but really based on what we're seeing on her property. I think that gave her some comfort in making that decision about what the time frame is for this building. The next property I wanted to talk to you all about is located in another neighborhood in Norfolk. It's called Larchmont. This neighborhood is probably seeing the most significant visual impact from flood mitigation in the city of Norfolk. You can see in the photograph at the bottom of my slide that there is a little Cape Cod house. That house is owned by a landlord who is not eligible to receive grant funding to elevate his home because it's not his primary residence. Also, he's concluded based on his now 13 or 14 years of ownership and the level of impact within the building that it probably would not be a good fiscal decision to invest in home elevation. This building was built in 1953. The neighborhood, though it could easily be listed on the state and national register, that undertaking has not occurred. And so there are no designations in place, meaning that this property is not eligible for an exemption to the requirement of full compliance for significant alterations in a special flood hazard area. The property owner has really done a lot of the work on his own, but we've coordinated and tracked that very closely because we're interested in his philosophy, and we think it's an approach that has merit that needs to be part of our toolkit. He has owned the property for a long time. I think at this point it's about 14 years, and he has had 2 flood episodes, each resulting in less than 6 inches of water in the building and each for less than 2 hours of duration. So based on that experience, he determined that he would rather set up a system for easy drying out and easy repair rather than go to the effort of elevating the property. You can see in this slide, the majority of his neighbors have elevated their homes. So he's the lone one on this block that has not. Next slide. The pictures on this slide show you some of his other neighbors and the different approaches to home elevation. And also this particular block is a very good, shows a timeline of the elevation requirements in the city. As one of the first blocks that really had active home elevation, some of those houses that were early to elevate were not brought up as high as some of the houses are being brought up today. And so you get this effect of different base flood elevations affecting the alignment of the first floor in different ways. At this point, he is in a high-risk area with a 9-foot base flood elevation. And in Norfolk, we have a 3-foot freeboard, which means the design flood elevation is 12 feet. His first floor level is on a crawl space. His primary concerns are that he cannot sell the property. He's tried multiple times and he's brought the price way down below what he initially paid for it. And in some ways, wisely, no one has elected to purchase the property. Another challenge he has is that this street floods on a regular basis. And so there are many sunny day flooding events that have no impact on the buildings, but make it impossible to get from the main arterial road into the neighborhood. So as a landlord property owner, he wants to ensure that his tenants have minimal disruption if there are flood events at this property. And so he has to have a way to turn the property very quickly if there is a flood. Next slide. He did have one FEMA flood insurance claim, and he engaged in the remediation as it was prescribed to him. His analysis is that in doing so, hindsight tells him he made a few mistakes along the way. He took out traditional building materials that he feels like would have been more resilient for future floods. And so what that means is now and into the future, when he has flood events, he has more material to purchase to reinstate back to pre-flood conditions. Whereas he feels like if he had retained some of those traditional building materials, he might have been able to dry them out and not remove them and replace them each cycle. He admits he does maintain flood insurance, but he prefers the flexibility and predictability of self-funding when he has a flood event. So his flood insurance is really there for the major event. And I should have mentioned early on, we in Hampton Roads have been very fortunate not to have truly a major storm event in quite some time, which has me worried, honestly, because I feel like maybe we're getting a little bit complacent about that. But we have been fortunate in not to face that challenge. So this property owner notes that the historic first floor bathroom is tile on a concrete pan with tile walls. And despite previous flooding, that material has all maintained it's unimpacted by the flooding. And so he really values those materials and says he will never touch that bathroom. The floor joists for the first floor and the subfloor and the flooring itself were all replaced in that one flood insurance claim. And so now he's in the cycle of replacement for that. You'll also notice that this house has a chair rail and a wainscot, and that material, everything below the chair rail is resilient material. It's mold and mildew resistant as well as water resistant. And that's so that if he has a flood event in the property, based on his experience, it would flood the first 6 inches of the property. And so he can easily knock those, the chair rail out and open up the wall so that there's breathability. In the next flood event, if it gets higher than that, he also would plan to elevate the electrical. He has baseboard heating in the first floor so that it's easy to replace rather than being concerned about ductwork. And he's got the air conditioning duct run from the second floor down in the knee walls of the second floor Cape Cod. Next slide. Oh, wait. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that he has calculated that if he gets a flood that is similar to the last several he's gotten, he can anticipate it will take 30 days to turn the property and it will cost him $8,000 out of pocket. And that's based on this constant process of evaluating efficiencies and identifying better and more effective ways to put the building back together. So that is his strategy. Next slide. This last case study is for a historic house museum that's owned by the city of Virginia Beach. It is an inland property, as you can see. It was built in 1805, and it is both a locally designated resource as well as individually listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. It is eligible for the FEMA enabled exemption, and fortunately the city of Virginia Beach also has that on its books. We were initially contacted actually to be the preservation consultant on a major renovation of the museum. And our task was to review the proposed architectural plans and provide a preservation treatment plan to ensure that the preservation best practices were followed in this rehabilitation project. Next slide. In the course of that work, we reviewed the prior renovations that had occurred on site. In the 1950s, the house had a major renovation in the basement, and that basement was turned into usable space. By the 70s, they were noticing moisture infiltration in the basement, so they began a series of campaigns to address that through moisture barriers. Those moisture barriers had failed on a couple of occasions, and so part of the scope of this 2020 rehabilitation was to reinstitute a similar design for keeping water out of the basement. The design that was recommended represents kind of best practices for new construction, but we noted this ongoing series of efforts that were very similar in nature and had failed to address the moisture issues adequately. So we recommended that we put some monitoring equipment in the basement and really determine the source of the water so that a more customized approach could be considered. Next slide. After talking with the property owner as a municipal government, they obviously intend to be stewards of this building for the duration. They wanted to maintain the basement as an accessible space, as a space that they could be used for their educational programming. They wanted to focus their efforts on determining the sources of water infiltration, and then also making sure that the design met what the building was telling us it needed. And they were okay with having maintenance staff available. They're okay with certain maintenance requirements that might be repetitive, as long as there were no special skills required. They needed to be able to use their own staff to perform whatever maintenance might be needed over time. Next slide. We installed equipment for 40 days in a portion of the building and 36 days in an addition. We also, about 2 weeks in, determined that it would be helpful to have some soil monitors to detect what was going on in the ground surrounding the building. We took the measurements 30-minute intervals, as we typically do. And we overlaid that with other meteorological data to determine what fluctuations we could see. Next slide. Our findings were sort of similar to the house in Ghent that I talked about. There were some kind of maintenance issues that needed to be addressed. There was some grading that was really driving water into the basement. And also the concrete slab that had been installed in the 50s was really pushing moisture up into the masonry walls. We determined that the waterproofing that had been installed over a couple of campaigns was actually, not only had it failed, but it was trapping moisture in the walls. And so reinstallation of that was not advisable. Next slide. So we developed a series of retrofit recommendations, which started with applying for another exemption because clearly we could not use the FEMA guidelines to solve this problem. It just wouldn't be effective. We had found a series of below grade, what looked like culverts below the basement floor. Ultimately, after further exploration, we concluded that those were an early version of air conditioning duct that had been since abandoned, but they might give us a path to collect moisture, groundwater, and direct it out of the building in a more controlled way. We need to definitely look at site regrading. We need to rethink the basement concrete slab and install a porous material because a lot of the issues in this property have to do with groundwater. That porous material will help equalize evaporation of water, and then implement an underground drainage system. Once those measures are undertaken, we'll reinstall our monitoring equipment to ensure that we have gotten the moisture content in the masonry to an acceptable level, and not just an acceptable level, but to a more uniform level to prevent the degradation of masonry that comes from drying and wetting. The exemption request for this property was approved, as for the previous properties that I included in these case studies. And so now we're in implementation mode at this building. In terms of what comes next, we have gotten approval to construct a lab module in a building that we have secured in the city of Suffolk, Virginia. Suffolk is in our region, but it's a little bit further afield from the flood risk areas. And so it gives us a place to be that, we don't have to worry in a major storm event that the lab will go down. The lab module will enable us to test traditional building materials to their extremes. And it will also enable us to test building assemblies over time. That will give us a more enhanced toolkit of retrofits that we can recommend to property owners. And if you think back to the first case study, I talked about the property owner who has the brick basement walls that are sort of deteriorating in sight. We have some more aggressive options that we could provide her with once we are able to test them in a controlled environment. And in summary, I think what we're trying to do is step back from that assumption that the FEMA options are the only options, and really take those aboard and then think about property owners and stewardship of properties to make sure that when those solutions don't work, that there are reasonable solutions for retrofits that have empirical data supporting them. And at that point, I will stop and be available for questions.
Paige, can you hear us at this point? I think we had just a little bit of an audio problem.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You can't hear us. So computer audio.
I'm going to go to my phone.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions, so we'll get you on your phone and then we'll start the Q&A. So I appreciated all of this information, and many times working with historic communities, more importantly, historic property owners, when we talk about things like toolkits, this is exactly what the property owners are looking for, these kind of best practices case studies for every unique situation on a historic property. So we've got a couple of questions actually directly related to that. Paige, can you Can you hear us now? It's like
I think she's still calling in. Give her another minute.
Thanks so much, Sean. I appreciate it. I will go ahead and just kind of note some good points. Paige mentioned the fact that some properties have increased vulnerability when an adjacent property owner actually adapts their property to the special flood hazard area requirements. I think that's something we all have to keep in mind, particularly those of us who deal with historic design review and adaptation in historic districts. So that would be a good point to keep in mind. I think she's still calling in.
Yeah, she's still calling in.
And then I think the other point too I'll make is that many of these issues aren't just addressing areas for flooding. They're also addressing what we're constantly dealing with moisture penetration in properties, whether it's basements that may find themselves.
I'm going to just start answering questions while this figures itself out.
Okay, so she can do the Q&A. We'll let her go from here.
So for the Larchmont case, can you guys still hear me?
Mhm.
For the Larchmont case, the waterway is substantial. The Larchmont is just to the south of the world's largest naval base, so you can imagine the size of the waterway. The inundation that's coming in, there's too much shoreline to be able to put deployable flood barriers, and there's also not sufficient yard size for individual property owners to do that without having adverse impacts on their adjacent, on their neighbors. So that's something we've looked at for a couple of projects in Norfolk that have more targeted sources of flooding, but this is just too broad stroke for that to really work. They have looked at flood barriers, logs for doorways, and we've used those. Certainly those are commonplace in Norfolk now, but if you're talking about the large ones that go all the way around the building, that's really, that's got a very specific set of appropriate applications, and when it works, it's great, but a lot of times it's just not the right match.
We've also got some Q&A questions, Paige, if you can hear me.
So in terms of practical solutions for rising damp, for the practical solutions for rising damp, I would say there are some options that can be considered. The most extreme would be to install sort of a sacrificial layer of plaster that would wick the water out and away from the masonry. That really you have to get to the source of the rising damp to figure out what the solution is. And that's why we do the monitoring that we do to make sure that we understand what the drivers are. And then the next question looks to be, what building materials were removed by the homeowner that he now regrets removing? I think that really had to do with the floor assembly. His property had old growth pine floor joists and subfloor with oak finished floors. And when he made his first FEMA insurance claim, because of concerns about mold, the requirement was that he would have to remove all of that traditional building material. And what went back was softer pine framing members and engineered wood subfloor. And I think he had an engineered wood floor, maybe a laminate floor. So those materials, every time they get wet, even if they're touched by water for 10 minutes, those materials have to be completely removed and he starts over. whereas the old growth and traditional building materials, had he been able to properly dry them out, prevent mold and that risk, he would have been able to refinish them and reuse retain the framing. So the next question has to do with, was any wet proofing done on it, the first case study, to deter water coming up through the brick basement floor? To be perfectly honest, our groundwater level is so high that there are very limited instances where wet proofing might be a good solution in our region. And the reason is that when you wet proof one side of a wall, then you're driving the water to the other side. So in the case of this property, if you were to wet proof the basement floor and the interior side of the walls, you would just be pushing the water out. And really what we were seeing is that the groundwater was unable to evaporate because of the concrete pour that was done between our client's house and the adjacent house. And so to push more water in the direction that it can't evaporate would just leave it sort of saturating the masonry wall. So that is the wet proofing option is rarely used effectively in our area. It can be used effectively. Next question, seems like the FEMA exemption option for historic properties is misleading as there is no exemption from the risk. Based on your experience, should we be referring to this as an alternative path to risk mitigation for properties instead? I think viewing that through the lens of a historic preservationist, it is an alternative path. That's well stated. I think when FEMA says that you must use these options, these are the options in our toolkit, that is a mandate. And the term exemption is their way of saying you're relieved of that mandate as long as you look at different ways to protect the building. So they're looking at the quote exemption as an exemption from their rule. Next question, are you aware of any companies that offer your suite of services for assessing the risk of historic properties with rubble foundations on Nantucket? To be perfectly honest with you, I never in a million years would have thought that we would be doing what we're doing. And we are doing what we do because we couldn't find anyone else who does it. So the short answer is no. We certainly are looking at all different types of building materials in all different parts of the country. Lisa had asked me to kind of take a localized approach today, which is why I focused on Hampton Roads. But this is the kind of thing we can apply to different building materials, and we'll be much more well equipped to do that once our lab is open, which will be before the end of this year. Let's see, that's amazing. Who requires the removal of traditional materials? Is it FEMA? Well, what FEMA is requiring is they're requiring the elimination of any risk of mold and mildew that would be detrimental to occupants. Problem is we as a preservation community have never proven that traditional building materials are more resistant to mold and mildew. And so one of the things our lab will do will be to address that. And our monitoring equipment is, someone's asking, is it available commercially? Can it be used by anyone or is training required? And I will tell you that it is a customized kit that we designed ourselves. And it's relatively easy to install, but the data redaction and analysis is pretty complex. So it's the type of thing that we will use for our clients. And so, you know, if you have a need for it, I'm happy to talk with you. I think Lisa will have my information up and we can certainly try and help you out. I am sorry about my technological issues today. I truly am. I wish I could hear you guys. But
Well, I want to thank you, Paige. Thank you very much. And we appreciate the fact that we have such a great expert here. I appreciate it also that the questions that came in are very appropriate to what we in the preservation community have been trying to address. This is why Paige was here presenting to us today, because we had a very long discussion about the need for this kind of assessment work. That goes much more beyond just understanding vulnerability, but what types of responses and reactions we can support for preservationists so that they do not take the exemption, because the risk, as Jim Lindbergh pointed out in his question, is still there, and we need to address these issues for the long-term protection of these properties in our neighborhoods. So all that said, I want to thank all of our speakers today and shout out to those people behind the scenes, Sean, Kim, and Karen, who overcame any of the technical difficulties. The presentation will be available and ready after our event, and Kim will get that out to all of those who have registered for the event. So no fear, you will see Paige's presentation as well as contact information for her should you want to follow up. Thanks again for participating in today's event, and if you haven't yet, please do register for tomorrow, where we'll have another great set of speakers. Enjoy your afternoon, and we will see you again tomorrow.